On a warm Sunday morning in late June 1914, the city of Sarajevo lay beneath a pale Balkan sun, its narrow streets stirring slowly to life. Church bells echoed across the Miljacka River. Market stalls opened. Tramlines hummed faintly. To the casual observer, it was an unremarkable day in an unremarkable provincial capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yet beneath the calm surface, unseen forces were already in motion, forces that would soon fracture empires, consume continents, and redefine the meaning of modern war. At the center of this moment stood a man who did not seek greatness, did not crave glory, and did not imagine himself as a martyr to history. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Este, heir to one of Europe's most powerful thrones, had come to Sarajevo on a routine inspection. He arrived as a symbol of imperial authority, but also as a man burdened by the contradictions of his age. Aristocrat and reformer, imperial heir and political outsider, target and catalyst. Within hours he would be dead. The shots fired that day would echo far beyond the streets of Sarajevo. They would reverberate through diplomatic halls in Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris, and London. They would transform political tension into mobilization, mobilization into invasion, and invasion into the most devastating war the world had yet known. But history, when stripped of its inevitability, does not begin with gunfire. It begins with context, with fear, resentment, ambition, and unresolved questions. To understand why Franz Ferdinand was killed, and whether his death can ever be described as justified, one must step back into the fragile world of early 20th century Europe. It was a continent armed to the teeth yet governed by aging emperors. A continent where nationalism burned hotter than reason, where alliances promised security but delivered catastrophe, and where peace survived not by stability but by delay. Europe in 1914 was a powder keg disguised as a drawing room. The great powers spoke the language of diplomacy, but thought in the logic of war. Germany, newly unified and industrially ascendant, sought its place in the sun. France carried the wound of defeat from 1871, nursing a quiet determination for revanche. Russia, vast and insecure, positioned itself as protector of Slavic peoples while struggling to maintain internal order. Britain watched the continent warily, committed to balance, yet bound by obligations it could not escape. And at the heart of this unstable system stood the Austro-Hungarian Empire, old, multi-ethnic, and cracking under the weight of its contradictions. The Habsburg monarchy ruled over dozens of nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Poles, and others. It was an empire held together not by unity, but by bureaucracy and tradition. Nationalist movements simmered within its borders, challenging imperial authority with demands for autonomy or independence. Nowhere was this tension more acute than in the Balkans. The Balkans were Europe's fault line. A region where empires met, overlapped, and clashed. The Ottoman Empire was in retreat. Austria-Hungary pushed southward. Russia extended its influence through shared Slavic identity. Serbia, newly emboldened after the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, emerged as a small but defiant kingdom with big ambitions. Serbia's dream was simple in concept and explosive in consequence: the unification of all South Slavs into a single nation. To Serbian nationalists, Bosnia-Herzegovina, annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, was not imperial territory. It was stolen land. Sarajevo, though administered by Vienna, was seen by many as a city under occupation. Franz Ferdinand knew this. Unlike many in the imperial court, the Archduke understood the dangers of nationalism. He recognized that the empire could not survive indefinitely without reform. His vision, often misunderstood, was one of federalization. He imagined transforming Austria-Hungary into a tripartite or even multinational state, granting greater autonomy to its Slavic populations. In theory, this would weaken Serbian influence by satisfying Slavic aspirations within the empire itself. Ironically, this made him more dangerous to Serbian nationalists than a hardline imperialist ever could be. To them, Franz Ferdinand was not merely an oppressor. He was a long-term threat. If his reforms succeeded, the justification for violent resistance would evaporate. The dream of a greater Serbia would be smothered not by force, but by compromise. For radical nationalists, compromise was betrayal. Thus, the Archduke's visit to Sarajevo on June 28 carried symbolic weight far beyond protocol. The date itself was charged with meaning. June 28, Vidovdan, was sacred in Serbian history, commemorating the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. It was a day of remembrance, sacrifice, and national identity. That the heir to the Habsburg throne would parade through Sarajevo on this date was perceived by some as provocation, by others as insult. Security preparations were minimal. The empire did not believe the threat was serious. Sarajevo was considered quiet. The Archduke traveled in an open car. The route was published in advance. The assumption was that order, once established, would endure. It was a fatal miscalculation. Hidden among the crowds lining the Appel Quay were young men who believed history could be bent by violence. They were not professional soldiers. They were students, clerks, idealists. Some were linked to the secret society known as the Black Hand, others to the loosely connected network called Young Bosnia. They shared little beyond conviction that tyranny must be struck at its symbol. They did not think in terms of global war. They did not imagine millions of dead. Their vision was narrow, personal, and absolute. To them, the assassination was not an act of terror, but of liberation. History, however, does not judge intent alone. It judges consequence. The first attempt on Franz Ferdinand's life failed. A bomb thrown at his motorcade bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded beneath another vehicle, injuring several officers. The procession continued. Decisions were made hastily. Routes were altered without clear communication. Confusion replaced caution. Minutes later, near the Latin Bridge, the wrong turn was taken. Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, stood stunned as the Archduke's car stalled directly in front of him. Fate, chance, or catastrophic coincidence placed the heir to the empire within arm's reach. Princip did not hesitate. 2 shots were fired. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The other struck his wife, Sophie, in the abdomen. Within minutes, both were dead. The world did not yet know what had happened. But the chain reaction had already begun. In Vienna, outrage hardened into resolve. In Berlin, support was promised. In St. Petersburg, honor demanded response. Alliances activated. Mobilizations followed. Diplomacy collapsed under the weight of pride and fear. What began as an assassination became a justification for war. What began as a local act became a global catastrophe. Yet the question remains, haunting historians and moral philosophers alike. Was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand justified? Was it an act of resistance against imperial domination, or a reckless murder that unleashed unimaginable suffering? Did the assassin strike a tyrant, or did he kill a man who might have prevented the very war his death ignited? To answer this question, one must move beyond myth and nationalism, beyond heroism and condemnation. To understand why Sarajevo became the stage for assassination, one must first understand the world that produced it. The murder of Franz Ferdinand did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the culmination of decades of unresolved tension, clashing identities, and imperial decay. Long before the pistol was raised, Europe had already begun its slow march toward disaster. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was an anachronism struggling to survive in a modernizing world. Its foundations had been laid in an earlier age, when dynastic legitimacy mattered more than national identity. But by 1914 the idea of empire itself was under siege. The empire stretched from the Alps to the Balkans, ruling over more than 50 million people who spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and remembered different histories. Germans and Hungarians dominated political power, while Slavic populations, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs, were increasingly restless. They were educated, politically aware, and inspired by nationalist movements sweeping across Europe. Nationalism was the defining force of the age. It promised dignity, self-rule, and historical destiny. But it also sharpened divisions and justified violence. In multi-ethnic empires, nationalism was not merely disruptive, it was existential. Austria-Hungary attempted to manage this tension through compromise. The dual monarchy, created in 1867, split authority between Austria and Hungary, granting each significant autonomy. But this solution satisfied only 2 groups, leaving others marginalized. Slavs, in particular, saw the arrangement as a betrayal. They were subjects, not partners. Franz Ferdinand observed this imbalance with growing concern. Unlike many in the Viennese court, he did not believe the empire could survive unchanged. He viewed Hungarian dominance as destabilizing and feared that continued repression of Slavic aspirations would lead to rebellion, or worse, foreign intervention. His proposed solution was radical by imperial standards. He envisioned restructuring the empire into a federation of semi-autonomous national units. In this vision, Slavs would gain recognition and political voice within the imperial framework. It was an attempt to preserve the empire by transforming it. But reform in an empire built on privilege creates enemies faster than allies. Hungarian elites despised Franz Ferdinand's ideas. Federalization threatened their power. Military leaders distrusted his pacifism. Court conservatives viewed him as abrasive, unpredictable, and dangerous. Even within his own family he was isolated. Yet beyond Vienna, in the Balkans, his reforms were perceived very differently. For Serbian nationalists, Franz Ferdinand represented a strategic threat. Serbia, though small, had emerged victorious from the Balkan Wars, doubling its territory and confidence. It saw itself as the nucleus of South Slavic unity. Its leaders believed history favored their cause. But if Slavs within Austria-Hungary were granted autonomy and loyalty to Vienna, Serbia's claim as liberator would collapse. A reformed empire would neutralize revolutionary fervor without firing a shot. From the perspective of radical nationalists, Franz Ferdinand's survival endangered their dream more than his death. This ideological conflict unfolded within a region already traumatized by war. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had shattered the old Ottoman order in southeastern Europe. Borders were redrawn hastily. Grievances multiplied. Violence became normalized. Entire populations were displaced. Victory convinced Serbia that force worked. At the same time, Austria-Hungary watched Serbian expansion with alarm. Vienna feared encirclement by Slavic nationalism backed by Russia. The annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908 had already brought the empire into direct confrontation with Serbian ambition. That crisis had been resolved diplomatically, but bitterness remained. Bosnia itself was a land of contradictions. Its population was divided among Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks. Each group carried different loyalties and memories. Austrian rule brought infrastructure, administration, and relative stability, but also foreign domination. Young Bosnians came of age under imperial authority but consumed nationalist literature. They read poetry about sacrifice and liberation. They studied European revolutionary movements. They believed history was shaped by decisive individuals willing to act. Many of them were idealists rather than strategists. They did not think in terms of geopolitics. They thought in terms of destiny. The Black Hand, formerly known as unification or death, operated in the shadows of Serbian military intelligence. It was not a mass movement, but a secretive network bound by oath and discipline. Its members believed assassination was a legitimate political tool. They saw themselves as guardians of the nation, acting where governments hesitated. Not every conspirator was a Black Hand operative. Some were loosely connected, others merely inspired. But all shared a belief that the moment demanded action. Meanwhile, Europe's alliance system transformed every regional crisis into a potential continental war. Austria-Hungary relied on Germany for support. Germany, fearing encirclement by Russia and France, committed itself to its ally with increasing rigidity. Russia, bound by pan-Slavic ideology and strategic interest, could not abandon Serbia without losing prestige. France, allied to Russia, stood ready. Britain, though hesitant, was tied to the balance of power. This system was designed to preserve peace through deterrence. In reality, it ensured that any spark would ignite multiple fronts. Franz Ferdinand understood this danger. He opposed preventive war against Serbia. He warned that conflict in the Balkans would draw in Russia and devastate Europe. Ironically, he was one of the strongest voices for restraint within the Austro-Hungarian leadership. His death removed that restraint. The decision to send him to Sarajevo was driven by routine, not strategy. Military maneuvers were scheduled in Bosnia. The Archduke, as Inspector General of the Armed Forces, was expected to attend. The visit was meant to demonstrate imperial presence, not provoke unrest. Yet symbolism matters in volatile regions. The presence of the heir to the throne on a sacred nationalist date, in a recently annexed province, created an atmosphere heavy with meaning. Warnings were ignored. Intelligence reports were vague. Security measures were insufficient. The empire underestimated the depth of resentment and overestimated its own control. On the streets of Sarajevo, the convergence of these forces became personal. Young men waited with pistols and bombs not because they believed success was certain, but because failure was intolerable. They believed that even an attempt would signal resistance. Behind them stood decades of humiliation, idealism sharpened by frustration, and a conviction that history favored the bold. Behind Franz Ferdinand stood an empire afraid of change, yet unable to survive without it. Between them lay a fragile peace sustained by habit rather than harmony. The assassination was not inevitable. But the conditions that made it possible were deeply entrenched. When the shots were fired, they did not create the crisis, they revealed it. The world Franz Ferdinand entered in Sarajevo was already unstable. His death merely exposed how little margin for error remained. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not the work of a single man acting on sudden impulse. It was the product of a fragmented conspiracy, improvised, poorly coordinated, and driven more by belief than by strategy. Its participants did not command armies, control governments, or possess certainty of success. What they possessed instead was conviction, and the dangerous assumption that history rewards resolve regardless of consequence. The young men who gathered around the idea of assassination did not resemble professional revolutionaries. They were students, apprentices, and clerks, products of an age in which nationalism offered meaning to those without power. Their education had exposed them to romantic ideals of martyrdom and liberation. Their environment had conditioned them to see violence not as tragedy, but as necessity. At the center of this loose network was Gavrilo Princip. Princip was born into poverty in a remote Bosnian village. Sickly, introspective, and intensely serious, he found purpose in nationalist ideology. Like many of his generation, he experienced imperial rule as humiliation rather than governance. To him, Austria-Hungary was not a state, it was an occupier. Yet Princip was not alone, and he was not the architect. The conspiracy emerged from the overlap of two movements, Young Bosnia and the Black Hand. Young Bosnia was not a formal organization. It was an idea, an intellectual current that blended South Slavic nationalism, revolutionary romanticism, and European radical thought. Its adherents debated poetry and philosophy as often as politics. They admired figures who had reshaped history through sacrifice. The Black Hand, by contrast, was disciplined, secretive, and operational. Its members were embedded within Serbian military intelligence. They believed that Serbia's survival depended on aggressive action against imperial encirclement. To them, assassination was a tool of statecraft, even if the state itself could not publicly acknowledge it. The connection between these two worlds was informal but decisive. Weapons did not come from ideology. They came from supply lines. In the spring of 1914, word reached Belgrade that Franz Ferdinand would visit Sarajevo. The information circulated quietly. For some, it was merely news. For others, it was opportunity. A symbolic target, exposed and predictable, presented itself. Within the Black Hand, there was no unanimous decision. Some considered the risk unacceptable. Others feared diplomatic fallout. But among younger operatives, hesitation was viewed as weakness. The empire had humiliated Serbia in 1908. The Balkan Wars had proven that force could alter reality. Waiting was no longer an option. A small number of conspirators were selected, not because they were ideal but because they were willing. Princip was one of several young Bosnians chosen. Alongside him were Nedeljko Kabrnovic, Trifko Grabez, and others whose names history would record briefly, then forget. None had formal training. None had operational experience. What they shared was a belief that their lives were already forfeit. The weapons they received were crude but effective: pistols, hand grenades, and cyanide capsules. The grenades were Serbian military issue. The pistols were compact, concealable. The cyanide was meant to ensure silence and death. Each item carried symbolic weight. The pistol represented agency. The bomb represented disruption. The poison represented martyrdom. There was no sophisticated escape plan. There was no extraction route. The assumption was simple: success would justify itself. Failure would still demonstrate intent. This mindset reflected a broader illusion: the belief that history bends immediately to decisive acts. The conspirators imagined that the assassination would awaken the South Slavs, paralyze the empire, and force change. They did not consider escalation beyond the Balkans. Europe, to them, was abstract. Their world was local and personal. On the morning of June 28, the conspirators positioned themselves along the motorcade route. They were spread out, each assigned a location. There was no central command, no real-time communication. Each man acted independently, bound only by expectation. The Archduke's procession moved slowly through Sarajevo. The atmosphere was tense but orderly. Police presence was minimal. Soldiers were conspicuously absent. The empire believed it was displaying confidence. In reality, it was exposing vulnerability. The first attacker hesitated. The second lost nerve. Then Kabrnovic threw his bomb. It struck the folded roof of the Archduke's car and bounced off, detonating beneath the following vehicle. The explosion injured several officers and civilians. Smoke filled the street. Panic rippled through the crowd. But Franz Ferdinand survived. The failure should have ended the operation. It should have dispersed the conspirators. Instead, it created confusion on both sides. The motorcade continued. Officials debated responses. The Archduke insisted on proceeding, then on visiting the wounded. Kabranovic attempted suicide. The cyanide failed. He was arrested. Princip, further down the route, believed the mission had collapsed. Then came the mistake. The driver, unaware of a change in plans, turned onto a side street. Realizing the error, he stopped to reverse. The engine stalled. The car halted mere feet from Princip's position. What followed was not calculated. It was reflexive. Princip stepped forward. He fired twice. In that moment, the illusion of control shattered. The conspirators had not orchestrated a flawless operation. They had stumbled into success through coincidence. Fate, chance, and incompetence converged. The Archduke slumped forward. Sophie collapsed beside him. Blood stained the upholstery. Within minutes, both were dead. The conspirators had achieved their objective. They had not achieved understanding. In Vienna, disbelief turned into rage. The assassination was not interpreted as an isolated act by radicals. It was framed as an attack on imperial sovereignty, facilitated by Serbian complicity. Evidence mattered less than perception. Responsibility was assumed. In Belgrade, officials scrambled to distance themselves. The Serbian government had not authorized the assassination. But denials rang hollow. The connections were too visible. The weapons too traceable. The ideology too aligned. The plan, such as it was, had succeeded tactically and failed strategically. Franz Ferdinand's death did not weaken the empire. It unified it. It silenced reformists and empowered hardliners. It transformed hesitation into resolve. The conspirators had expected liberation. They had delivered justification. This was the central tragedy of the assassination, the gap between intention and outcome. The men who fired and supplied the weapons believed they were striking a decisive blow against oppression. In reality, they removed one of the few figures capable of preventing catastrophe. History would remember the act. It would debate its morality. But it would judge its consequences without mercy. And those consequences were already unfolding. The moment the pistol fired in Sarajevo, history crossed a threshold from which it could not retreat. What followed was not immediate war but something far more dangerous: certainty. Certainty in Vienna that the empire had been attacked. Certainty among generals that restraint was no longer viable. Certainty among diplomats that credibility now mattered more than compromise. In the immediate aftermath, the streets of Sarajevo dissolved into confusion. Civilians scattered. Police rushed toward the Latin Bridge. Princip was seized, beaten, and dragged away. Blood still stained the street as authorities attempted to reassert control. To the city's residents, the assassination felt sudden and surreal. To the imperial administration, it was an unforgivable breach of order. Franz Ferdinand's death was confirmed within hours. Sophie followed soon after. Their bodies were transported quietly, almost discreetly, as if the empire itself hesitated to confront what had happened. There was no public display of grief in Sarajevo. Instead, anger simmered beneath enforced calm. Anti-Serb riots erupted across the city. Shops were looted. Homes were destroyed. Austrian authorities, slow to intervene, allowed violence to run its course. In these first hours, lines were drawn not by evidence but by identity. In Vienna, the reaction hardened rapidly. The assassination was framed not as a crime, but as an act of war by proxy. Senior officials argued that Serbia had become a permanent destabilizing force in the Balkans. The question was no longer whether Serbia was complicit, but whether Austria-Hungary could afford to tolerate its existence as a hostile neighbor. The empire's leadership gathered in urgency. Some urged caution. Others demanded decisive action. What tipped the balance was not outrage alone, but fear that failure to respond forcefully would expose imperial weakness and invite further disintegration. Austria-Hungary turned to Germany. Berlin's response would shape everything that followed. German leaders, themselves anxious about encirclement and declining strategic options, offered what later became known as the blank check. It was a promise of unconditional support, regardless of consequences. With German backing secured, Vienna prepared its next move. Yet this was not a rush to war. It was a measured escalation, deliberate and calculated. Diplomacy would be used, not to resolve the crisis, but to justify action already decided upon. The assassination had provided the moral and political opening. Now the empire would define the terms. An ultimatum to Serbia was drafted. Its demands went far beyond justice. They challenged Serbian sovereignty directly, insisting on Austrian participation in internal investigations and suppression of nationalist movements. The document was designed not for acceptance, but for refusal. When the ultimatum was delivered on July 23, 1914, Europe held its breath. Serbia responded with unexpected restraint. It accepted nearly all demands, rejecting only those that violated its constitution. In another context, the response might have preserved peace. In this one, it was irrelevant. Austria-Hungary declared the reply insufficient. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination, the empire declared war on Serbia. The first shells fell on Belgrade shortly thereafter. What had begun as a localized act of violence now became armed conflict between states. Yet even at this stage, the war was not inevitable on a continental scale. That transformation would require reaction driven by fear, obligation, and momentum. Russia could not remain passive. As Serbia's protector and fellow Slavic power, it faced a choice between credibility and caution. Mobilization orders were issued, first partially, then fully. These were defensive measures in intent, but offensive in appearance. Germany interpreted Russian mobilization as a threat. Its own war plans were rigid, timed to the movement of trains and men. Delay was dangerous. On August 1, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, it declared war on France. When German forces crossed into Belgium, Britain entered the conflict. In just over a month, Europe had gone from assassination to world war. Yet in retrospect, the initial reactions reveal something critical. The assassination itself did not cause the war. It activated decisions already waiting to be made. The alliances, the mobilization schedules, the strategic doctrines, all were in place. Sarajevo was the ignition, not the fuel. For the conspirators, this outcome was unimaginable. They had expected shock, perhaps repression, perhaps local unrest. They had not anticipated global war. Their act had been symbolic, not strategic. For Franz Ferdinand, the irony was complete. In life, he had opposed war with Serbia. In death, he became its justification. The first contact, then, was not between armies but between assumptions and reality. Leaders discovered that once violence was sanctioned, it could not be contained. Each move compelled another. Each decision narrowed the space for retreat. The world crossed into war not because everyone wanted it, but because no one believed they could afford not to act. And so, the guns opened fire, not only on borders but on the fragile illusion that reason alone could restrain power. What followed the first declarations of war was not the swift, decisive conflict imagined by Europe's leaders. It was confusion on a continental scale. The mechanisms of modern war, mobilization, rail transport, mass conscription, industrial firepower, were unleashed with confidence, yet without comprehension of their full implications. The assassination had been a singular act. The war that followed was systemic, grinding, and indifferent to intention. In the opening weeks, optimism prevailed. Generals spoke of short campaigns and decisive battles. Soldiers marched believing they would be home by winter. Civilians cheered from station platforms, convinced that national honor demanded sacrifice. The machinery of war moved with precision, but its destination was catastrophe. Austria-Hungary's initial campaign against Serbia exposed the first cracks. Despite numerical superiority and modern artillery, the Imperial Army struggled against determined Serbian resistance. Terrain favored the defenders. Command was disjointed. Logistics faltered. Serbian forces, hardened by recent Balkan conflicts, fought with experience and resolve. Battles along the Drina and Kolubara rivers devolved into chaos. Austro-Hungarian units advanced without coordination, suffered heavy losses, and were forced into humiliating retreats. The empire that had sought swift punishment instead found itself bogged down, bleeding morale and manpower. This failure carried psychological weight. It revealed that imperial authority did not guarantee military competence. The war was already diverging from expectation. On the Western Front, events escalated even faster. Germany's war plan demanded speed. The Schlieffen Plan envisioned a rapid strike through Belgium to knock France out of the war before turning east against Russia. It was a strategy built on timing, precision, and assumption. Reality intervened immediately. Belgian resistance slowed the advance. British forces arrived sooner than expected. French counterattacks disrupted German momentum. The armies collided along a vast front, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Within weeks, maneuver gave way to entrenchment. Soldiers dug into the earth as machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, and barbed wire transformed the battlefield. Attacks that once would have decided wars now produced only casualties. The ground absorbed blood, shell fragments, and hope in equal measure. The war of movement became a war of attrition. In the east, Russian mobilization was chaotic but relentless. Vast armies surged forward, overwhelming Austro-Hungarian forces in Galicia. The empire reeled under the pressure, saved from collapse only by German intervention. What had begun as punishment of Serbia now threatened Austria-Hungary's survival. The assassination that was meant to affirm imperial strength instead exposed imperial weakness. Franz Ferdinand's death, used to justify war, now revealed how unprepared the empire was for the conflict it had chosen. For soldiers at the front, the connection to Sarajevo was abstract. Few had heard of the Archduke. Fewer still understood the politics. What they knew was mud, exhaustion, fear, and the constant presence of death. Modern war erased individuality. Men lived in trenches flooded with water and vermin. Shells fell without warning. Orders sent thousands forward into machine gun fire for gains measured in meters. Courage became routine. Survival became chance. The war expanded beyond Europe. Colonial troops were mobilized. Naval blockades strangled economies. Civilians became targets through starvation and bombardment. Industrial output became as decisive as battlefield performance. The conflict devoured resources and lives at a scale unseen in human history. As casualties mounted, the original cause faded from public consciousness. Governments no longer spoke of Franz Ferdinand. They spoke of sacrifice, destiny, and necessity. The assassination had served its purpose. It had unified opinion long enough to start the war. Now the war justified itself. This was the true reality revealed by the conflict. Once unleashed, war no longer requires moral clarity. It sustains itself through momentum and fear. For Serbia, the cost was devastating. The country lost a staggering portion of its population. Entire villages disappeared. Disease ravaged both soldiers and civilians. The liberation imagined by the conspirators became a struggle for survival. For Austria-Hungary, the war accelerated internal collapse. Nationalist tensions intensified. Loyalty fractured. The empire fought on, but its cohesion eroded with every casualty list. For Europe, the war marked the end of an era. The old order, built on monarchy, hierarchy, and restraint, was consumed by industrialized violence. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, nothing remained unchanged. In retrospect, the assassination appears almost insignificant compared to the scale of destruction that followed. Yet without it, the war might have been delayed, altered, or avoided. That uncertainty fuels the enduring debate. Was the assassination a necessary act against imperial domination, or a reckless spark that ignited forces beyond control? The reality of war offers its own answer. War does not distinguish between justice and justification. It punishes all participants equally. It transforms ideals into ruins and intentions into graves. The conspirators believed they were shaping history. In truth, history consumed them, along with millions of others who had no voice in the decision. Sarajevo was only the beginning. The reality that followed was far darker than anything its streets had witnessed. As the war ground on, its true nature revealed itself not in maps or communiques, but in the minds of those forced to fight it. The human experience of the conflict bore little resemblance to the ideals that had justified its beginning. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand had been framed in abstract terms: honor, sovereignty, liberation. The war it unleashed reduced those concepts to endurance and survival. For the soldier in the trench, the cause was distant and irrelevant. What mattered was the next shell, the next order, the next hour endured without death. Men lived in a perpetual state of tension. The front lines were never silent, only briefly less violent. Artillery fire shattered sleep and sanity alike. The anticipation of attack was often worse than the attack itself. Soldiers learned to fear stillness, because it usually preceded disaster. Psychological strain became as lethal as bullets. What later generations would call shell shock manifested in tremors, paralysis, muteness, and breakdown. At the time, it was poorly understood and often punished. Officers interpreted psychological collapse as cowardice or weakness. Executions for desertion or refusal to fight were carried out to maintain discipline, even as the system itself inflicted the damage. Fear was constant, but so was fatigue. Months passed without relief. Rotations were irregular. Leave was rare. Trenches flooded in rain and froze in winter. Lice infested uniforms. Rats fed on the dead. Disease spread unchecked. The body adapted to deprivation but the mind eroded. Camaraderie became the primary defense against despair. Soldiers relied on one another not for ideology but for survival. Bonds formed under fire were immediate and intense. The death of a comrade was felt as personal loss, repeated endlessly until numbness replaced grief. On all sides, soldiers shared the same experience, though they fought under different flags. Serbian infantrymen endured hunger and disease during retreats through mountains. Austro-Hungarian units fractured along ethnic lines, loyalty strained by nationalist resentment. German and French soldiers faced each other across no man's land, separated by meters and ideology, yet united by suffering. The war blurred distinctions. Civilians, too, became part of the battlefield. Blockades starved populations. Cities were shelled. Families waited years for sons who would never return. Propaganda demanded sacrifice while hiding reality. Truth became a casualty of morale. In Serbia, the cost was especially severe. The country suffered one of the highest proportional death rates of the war. Entire generations were lost. The liberation envisioned by nationalists was achieved only after devastation that nearly erased the nation itself. Within Austria-Hungary, the war intensified internal fractures. Soldiers from different nationalities questioned why they fought for an empire that denied them equality. Desertion increased. Trust eroded. Franz Ferdinand's vision of reform, once controversial, now appeared tragically absent. For those who remembered him, the irony was unmistakable. The man whose death justified war had opposed it. His assassination silenced a voice of caution at the moment it was needed most. The conspirators, too, experienced the human cost. Gavrilo Princip did not live to see the war's end. Too young to be executed, he was imprisoned under harsh conditions. Tuberculosis ravaged his body. He died in 1918, emaciated and broken, as the empire he hated collapsed around him. There was no triumph in his end. No vindication. Only decay. This human dimension exposes the central moral tension of the assassination. Acts of political violence are often judged by intention. But war judges by consequence. Millions who had no role in the decision paid the price for a belief held by a few. The war did not ask whether Franz Ferdinand deserved to die. It did not consider justification. It demanded lives relentlessly and without discrimination. In this reality, the language of heroism dissolved. What remained was endurance, men surviving not because they believed but because they could not escape. By the war's later years, enthusiasm had vanished. What replaced it was obligation. Soldiers fought because retreat meant punishment, because surrender meant shame, because the war had consumed too much to abandon. The assassination had promised clarity. The war delivered ambiguity and loss. In the end, the human experience of World War I offers the most sobering judgment of all. It suggests that even if one believes the cause was just, the method ensured that justice would be indistinguishable from cruelty. History often remembers decisions. It rarely remembers endurance. Yet it was endurance that defined the war born in Sarajevo. History often assigns clarity after the fact. In the moment there was none. To each side drawn into the conflict unleashed by Sarajevo, the assassination carried a different meaning, filtered through fear, memory, and strategic necessity. Understanding whether Franz Ferdinand's death was justified requires examining not only the perpetrators and their supporters, but also those who stood opposite them, watching events unfold with alarm rather than celebration. For Austria-Hungary, the assassination was not interpreted as political expression. It was understood as existential threat. The empire had lived for decades under the pressure of nationalist agitation. Assassinations, uprisings, and conspiracies were not theoretical dangers. They were lived experience. Italian nationalists had already claimed imperial territory. Hungarian separatism challenged unity from within. Slavic nationalism threatened to tear the empire apart along its southern frontier. From Vienna's perspective, Sarajevo was proof that tolerance had failed. The fact that the assassins were young, idealistic, and poorly organized did not mitigate the danger. If anything, it intensified it. The empire saw not a single act but a pattern, an environment in which radicalism flourished across borders, encouraged by Serbia and shielded by Russia. Evidence mattered less than perception. Serbia's denials rang hollow because they fit too neatly into existing fears. The weapons were Serbian. The networks extended into Belgrade. The ideology mirrored Serbian national ambition. To imperial leaders, restraint now appeared reckless. In military circles, the assassination confirmed long-held warnings. Officers had argued that Serbia was an incubator of instability. They believed that decisive action delayed too long would only grow more costly. Sarajevo validated their case. From this viewpoint, Franz Ferdinand's death was not a tragedy alone, it was a message. It declared that imperial authority could be challenged publicly and violently. If unanswered, it would invite repetition. Thus, the empire did not ask whether the Archduke deserved his fate. It asked whether the state itself could survive without response. Germany's perspective was shaped by strategic anxiety rather than moral outrage. Berlin viewed the assassination through the lens of encirclement. Russia's growth alarmed German planners. France's alliance with Russia promised a two-front war. Britain's intentions were uncertain but ominous. Austria-Hungary was Germany's only reliable ally. If it appeared weak, Germany's strategic position would collapse. Supporting Vienna was not merely loyalty, it was self-preservation. From Berlin, the assassination was dangerous not because of its injustice, but because of its implications. A failure to act decisively might encourage further destabilization. In this calculation, escalation was risk, but inaction was fatal. Russia, by contrast, perceived Sarajevo as a test of credibility. To abandon Serbia would be to abandon pan-Slavic identity and great power status. Russian leaders were not blind to Serbia's recklessness. They understood the dangers of escalation. But they also understood that humiliation would weaken Russia internally and internationally. From St. Petersburg, Austria-Hungary's ultimatum looked less like justice and more like domination. The assassination became secondary. What mattered was the balance of power in the Balkans. France saw the crisis as confirmation of inevitability. French leaders believed war with Germany was unavoidable. Sarajevo did not create that belief, it reinforced it. The assassination mattered less than the mobilizations it triggered. France's role was defined by alliance, not by judgment of guilt. Britain, initially distant, observed with growing unease. British policymakers did not view Franz Ferdinand as a tyrant or martyr. To them, the assassination was alarming but local. What changed their perspective was not Sarajevo but Belgium. Once German armies crossed a neutral state, the moral frame shifted. The war became about law and balance, not Balkan nationalism. And what of Serbia, the state most closely linked to the assassins? Within Serbia, reactions were complex. There was no official celebration. The government understood the danger immediately. It feared annihilation. Sympathy for the assassins existed among segments of the population, but it was tempered by dread. Serbian leaders did not believe Franz Ferdinand's death had brought liberation. They feared it had invited destruction. This contrast is critical. The assassination was conceived by radicals, not states. It was celebrated by ideologues, not governments. Once it occurred, control passed instantly to powers whose priorities had nothing to do with justice or reform. From the enemy perspective, Sarajevo was not about morality. It was about authority, deterrence, and survival. Each side interpreted the act through its own vulnerabilities. Austria-Hungary saw collapse. Germany saw encirclement. Russia saw humiliation. France saw inevitability. Britain saw destabilization. Serbia saw disaster. None saw justice. This multiplicity of perspectives exposes the flaw in framing the assassination as justified or unjustified in isolation. The act cannot be separated from the world it entered, a world primed to transform violence into war. The enemy perspective reveals a sobering truth. Even if the assassins believed they were striking tyranny, those they struck did not receive the message that way. They heard only threat. And in international politics, perceived threat demands response. Sarajevo was not a dialogue. It was a rupture. And once the rupture occurred, each side acted not on moral evaluation, but on fear of what inaction might bring. In that space, justification lost meaning. Power took its place. Once war began, it no longer revolved around Sarajevo or Franz Ferdinand. The assassination had fulfilled its function as catalyst. What followed was escalation, methodical, relentless, and increasingly detached from the event that had ignited it. Nations adapted not to prevent catastrophe, but to survive within it. The first adaptation was psychological. Governments reframed the war in absolute terms. It was no longer about alliances or borders, but about existence. Victory became synonymous with survival. Compromise became indistinguishable from defeat. In this atmosphere, escalation was not a choice, it was a requirement. Military doctrine evolved under pressure. Early strategies, built on mobility and decisive engagement, collapsed under industrial firepower. Commanders learned through failure. Attacks were refined, then repeated. Artillery barrages grew longer and more destructive. Infantry tactics adjusted to minimize exposure, but losses remained staggering. New weapons entered the battlefield. Poison gas drifted across trenches, blinding and suffocating. Tanks appeared as experimental responses to stalemate. Aircraft transitioned from reconnaissance to combat. Submarines extended the war into the oceans, targeting supply lines and civilians alike. Each adaptation promised advantage. Each ensured prolongation. The war expanded geographically. Fighting spread to the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Empires mobilized colonial subjects, drawing millions into a conflict rooted in European politics. Local grievances were subsumed by global strategy. The assassination that had once seemed provincial now echoed worldwide. On the home front, societies transformed. Industry was reorganized for war. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers. Rationing became routine. Civil liberties were restricted. Propaganda reshaped perception, sustaining morale by simplifying reality. In this environment, memory of Franz Ferdinand faded almost entirely. His name appeared occasionally in speeches or memorials, but the war no longer needed him. The justification had matured into doctrine. Adaptation also occurred within leadership. Political figures who had hesitated in 1914 hardened. Those who had warned against war were marginalized or silenced. Military necessity overrode moral doubt. Decisions were measured in divisions, not lives. The assassination's original question, whether the act was justified, became irrelevant to those directing the war. Justification was now derived from endurance. The longer a nation fought, the more it believed it must continue, if only to validate the sacrifice already made. Even among populations, adaptation took hold. Initial enthusiasm gave way to resignation. Civilians learned to live with absence and loss. Grief became private. Survival became collective discipline. The war's abnormality normalized itself. Yet adaptation did not mean control. Each escalation produced unintended consequences. Submarine warfare drew neutral powers into the conflict. Blockades created famine. Technological innovation outpaced ethical consideration. The war evolved faster than the capacity to manage it. By 1917, the conflict had consumed the very structures it relied upon. Revolutions erupted. Empires fractured. Soldiers mutinied. The war's momentum exceeded its architect's intentions. Sarajevo, once the focal point, now seemed distant and almost irrelevant. Yet its legacy persisted in the logic of escalation. The assassination had demonstrated how violence could force decision. War institutionalized that lesson. Violence became policy. This progression underscores the central tragedy. The assassination was an act aimed at change. The war that followed adapted that act into system, efficient, impersonal, and self-sustaining. By adapting to war, societies lost the capacity to imagine peace. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world that emerged bore little resemblance to the one that had existed before Sarajevo. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand had not merely triggered a war, it had accelerated the collapse of an entire international order. Its outcomes were not confined to victory or defeat. They were structural, irreversible, and global. The most immediate consequence was human loss. More than 16 million were dead. Tens of millions more were wounded, displaced, or traumatized. Entire regions were depopulated. A generation of young men vanished from Europe's demographic core. The war left scars not only on bodies, but on societies struggling to comprehend the scale of devastation. No political objective achieved in 1918 could plausibly justify this cost. Austria-Hungary, the empire most directly connected to the assassination, did not survive the war it had chosen. By its end, the Habsburg monarchy collapsed under the weight of military defeat, economic exhaustion, and internal rebellion. New nation-states emerged from its ruins: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, each shaped by unresolved ethnic tensions. In this sense, the nationalist aims that had motivated the assassins were partially realized. South Slavic unity was achieved in the form of Yugoslavia. Bosnia was no longer under Habsburg rule. Yet the cost was catastrophic and the result fragile. The empire's collapse raises an unavoidable question. Was Franz Ferdinand an obstacle to liberation, or a missed opportunity for peaceful reform? Germany too paid a profound price. Defeat shattered imperial authority. Revolution overthrew the Kaiser. The Treaty of Versailles imposed territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations that bred resentment and instability. The war's end did not bring closure. It planted the seeds for future conflict. Russia's outcome was even more transformative. The strain of war accelerated internal collapse, leading to revolution and civil war. The Russian Empire disappeared, replaced by a radically different political system whose global impact would shape the next century. France and Britain emerged victorious but weakened. Their societies were exhausted, their economies strained, their faith in progress shaken. Victory felt hollow, defined more by survival than triumph. Serbia, the state whose nationalist cause lay closest to the assassination, suffered disproportionately. Its population was devastated. Its territory expanded, but its internal cohesion was fragile. The new Yugoslav state inherited the same nationalist contradictions that had plagued Austria-Hungary. The assassination's promise of liberation delivered a new cycle of instability. On a broader level, the war transformed how power was exercised. Empires fell. Nation-states multiplied. Warfare became industrialized and total. Civilians became targets. Ideology hardened. Most significantly, the war redefined legitimacy. Before 1914, dynastic rule and imperial continuity had framed political authority. After 1918, legitimacy increasingly derived from nationalism, mass participation, and ideology. This shift brought empowerment but also volatility. The assassination's consequences thus extend beyond borders and treaties. They altered the moral architecture of international relations. Political violence was no longer unthinkable. War was no longer exceptional. Both became tools within a brutalized system. From this perspective, Franz Ferdinand's death achieved none of its immediate aims. It did not prevent war. It did not limit suffering. It did not produce a stable or just outcome. Even the partial victories of nationalism were undermined by new conflicts and unresolved grievances. The assassination mattered not because it was decisive, but because it exposed fragility. It revealed how little pressure was required to collapse a system that relied on deterrence, pride, and assumption rather than trust. It showed how quickly violence could become self-justifying once embedded in state action. In assessing outcome and consequence, the moral calculus becomes stark. The act that was meant to free peoples instead multiplied their suffering. The removal of one man removed restraint, not oppression. History does not ask whether Franz Ferdinand deserved to die. It asks what his death produced. The answer is written in collapsed empires, altered borders, mass graves, and a century shaped by the war that followed. A century after the shots in Sarajevo, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand remains burdened with interpretation. It is remembered not merely as an event, but as a question, one that resists final resolution. Was the act justified? Was it inevitable? Or was it a tragic miscalculation that revealed the danger of believing violence can control history? The legacy of Sarajevo is not found in a single answer. It exists in tension between intention and consequence. Gavrilo Princip did not imagine himself as a mass murderer. He believed he was striking a symbol of oppression. In his mind, Franz Ferdinand represented imperial domination, not reform. The world as Princip experienced it offered few peaceful paths to change. Violence appeared decisive, even righteous. Yet history does not evaluate acts solely by motive. Franz Ferdinand, for all his flaws, was not a tyrant in the conventional sense. He was not responsible for annexation, repression, or military aggression. He did not design the empire's injustices, and he actively sought to reform them. His assassination removed a potential brake on war at the very moment restraint was most needed. This contradiction lies at the heart of the moral problem. The assassination exposed the danger of symbolic violence. Symbols simplify reality. They compress complex systems into individuals. When a symbol is destroyed, its meaning does not disappear, it transforms. Franz Ferdinand's death did not weaken imperial power. It consolidated it, briefly and catastrophically. The lesson is not that resistance is illegitimate, but that violence rarely behaves as its authors intend. Sarajevo also demonstrates how fragile peace can be when sustained by fear rather than trust. Europe in 1914 was not stable, it was suspended. The assassination revealed how little pressure was required to collapse the system. It showed that deterrence without flexibility creates conditions in which any shock becomes existential. Another enduring lesson lies in responsibility. The assassins acted. But so did generals, ministers, and emperors who chose escalation over restraint. Sarajevo did not force war, it enabled it. The catastrophe that followed was not the product of one bullet, but of a sequence of decisions made by men who believed war could be controlled. In this sense, moral responsibility is distributed, not concentrated. The war's legacy reshaped how history remembers political violence. Assassination became both feared and mythologized. Some saw Princip as a liberator. Others saw him as a terrorist. These interpretations often reflect later political needs more than historical reality. Memory became contested. In Yugoslavia, Princip was celebrated for decades as a hero of national liberation. Elsewhere, he was remembered as the man who started a world war. Both views simplify a far more complex truth. The deeper legacy of Sarajevo lies in its warning. It warns that moral certainty can coexist with catastrophic error. It warns that youth, idealism, and conviction are not safeguards against disaster. It warns that removing a figure does not remove a system, and may strengthen it. Most importantly, it warns that once violence becomes acceptable as a political instrument, its use expands beyond control. The question of justification then must be reframed. Was the assassination understandable? Yes. Was it inevitable? No. Was it justified by its outcome? History offers a clear answer. The war that followed destroyed more lives, societies, and futures than the empire the assassins sought to weaken. Whatever injustice existed before 1914 was magnified, not resolved by the conflict. Sarajevo teaches that history is shaped not only by what people oppose, but by what they unleash. In the end, Franz Ferdinand's death stands as a reminder that the moral weight of an action cannot be measured at the moment it is taken. It can only be measured by what follows. And what followed was a century defined by the consequences of believing that one act could purify a broken world.